The golden crown came down. It touched another woman's head with a sharp, cold ring of metal against stone. And, in that single moment, 500 wolves held their breath. Mira Shadowfen stood perfectly still beneath the cathedral lights. Her hands were folded in front of her. Her spine was straight. Her face showed nothing. Not pain, not fury, not the quiet devastation pulling at every corner of her heart. Because she had promised herself, years ago, that she would never beg for what she deserved. Up on the raised platform at the center of the Moonfang Cathedral, Alpha King Evander Grimm lifted his chin and addressed his kingdom. His voice was deep, certain, unbreakable. From this night forward, Lady Callista Emberlyn shall stand beside me as the future Luna Queen of the Northern clans. Her grace, her strength, and her loyalty have earned her this place at my side. Before the moon goddess and all gathered witnesses, I make this vow. The cathedral erupted. Cheers rose to the vaulted ceiling. Alphas beat their fists against their chests. Wolves howled with joy into the cold night air above the cathedral dome. Callista Emberlyn turned on the platform, her silver gown catching the light, and she smiled at the crowd below her the way a woman smiles when she has finally won a long, exhausting war. And then, slowly, deliberately, she turned her eyes across the crowd until they found Mira. That smile did not change. It deepened. Mira looked down at her feet. On the white marble floor near her right shoe, a silver goblet lay on its side, its contents spreading in a slow, dark ribbon across the stone. Someone near her had dropped it when the crowd surged forward to celebrate. The wine looked almost like blood against all that white. She had seen real blood on white stone before. 15 years ago, in a ruined temple, in a winter so brutal it could strip the bark from trees, she had pressed her hands against a boy's torn side and told him to breathe. She had torn a strip of crimson cloth from her own traveling cloak and bound his bleeding wrist. She had stayed awake for 3 nights while ice storms shook the walls around them. Feeding him broth, she warmed over a dying fire, watching his face for any sign of fever. She had saved his life with her bare hands, and the boy had grown into a king. This king, the one standing up there now, placing a crown on a different woman's head. Mira inhaled once, slow, clean, deliberate. Then she turned and walked toward the cathedral doors. No tears, no scene, no final look back, just silence. And somehow that silence was louder than anything else in the room. Because across the cathedral, through 500 celebrating wolves, Evander Grimm watched her go. And for the first time since becoming king, he could not bring himself to look Mira Shadowfen in the eyes. Hi, and welcome back. Before we go any further, I need to ask you something personal, and I want you to answer honestly in the comments below. Have you ever given everything you had, your time, your energy, your loyalty, to someone who only realized your worth after you were already gone? Drop a yes or no in the comments right now. I read every single one, and I genuinely want to know. And if this kind of story speaks to you, if you love tales about quiet strength, real love, and the moment someone finally wakes up too late, make sure you hit that subscribe button and tap the like button before this video ends. It helps more people find stories like this one, and it means the world to this channel. Now, let's go back to Mira Shadowfen, because the night has barely begun, and she is just getting started. Chapter 1. The weight of invisible hands. The cathedral had never felt smaller. Mira moved through the celebrating crowd the way water moves through stone, quietly, without disturbing anything, leaving no trace. Nobles laughed around her. Warriors raised goblets. Young wolves pushed toward the platform to catch a glimpse of their future Luna Queen in her silver gown. Nobody stopped Mira. Nobody reached for her arm. Nobody said her name. She had spent 12 years inside these walls, and she passed through this crowd like a ghost. She almost laughed. Almost. She reached the side corridor near the cathedral's east wing, the passage that connected the Great Hall to the royal advisory chambers, and she stopped. Not because she was lost. She had walked this corridor more times than she could count. She stopped because she heard footsteps behind her, sharp and deliberate. Leaving early. Callista's voice was soft, conversational, the way a blade sounds soft just before it finds the gap between your ribs. Mira turned. Callista stood at the mouth of the corridor in her silver gown, the new Luna crown glinting on her dark hair. She looked radiant. She looked like every painting of a queen that had ever hung in the Moonfang galleries. She looked like she had planned this exact moment. "Congratulations," Mira said. Her voice was level. Callista stepped closer. "You know," she said, "I always admired your patience. 12 years, working in the shadows, solving problems nobody else could see." She tilted her head slightly. "But patience without position is just waiting," Mira met her eyes. "Some women build kingdoms," she said quietly. "Others are simply chosen to rule them." Callista's smile flickered just once, at the edges. "And some women," Callista replied, "mistake loyalty for love and spend their lives waiting for a man to notice the difference." She turned and walked back toward the celebration. Mira stood in the corridor alone. She reached up and unpinned the small royal crest from her collar, the silver wolf's head that marked her as a senior royal advisor to the Northern Throne. She had earned it after the Frostclaw negotiations 3 years ago, when she had prevented a border war with nothing more than a map, 2 witnesses, and 48 sleepless hours. She set it on the stone ledge beside the corridor doorway. It made almost no sound at all. Outside, rain had begun. Mira walked out of the cathedral into the cold night and did not look back. Inside the great hall, behind her, the celebration continued at full volume. But one of the senior council elders, a gray-bearded wolf named Theron Wildfang, who had watched 4 Luna Queens crowned in his lifetime, stood near the side corridor and looked toward the empty doorway where Mira had been. He said nothing. He simply set down his goblet, and in 60 years of royal service, Theron Wildfang had only ever done that at funerals. Chapter 2. The cold after rain does not care about grief. It falls anyway, steady and indifferent and cold. Mira's carriage moved through the mountain roads south of Moonfang, keep at a pace that matched her mood. Slow, without destination, with no urgency left in it. She had packed before the ceremony. Not out of premonition, exactly. More out of the quiet knowledge that had been building inside her chest for weeks. The knowledge that had no name until tonight finally gave it one. She sat with her cloak pulled around her shoulders and watched the black trees move past the carriage window. 12 years. She had come to Evander's court at 19, newly graduated from the Wolf Scholars Guild, carrying 2 recommendations and a reputation for solving border disputes before they became border wars. She had told herself then that she was there to serve the kingdom, that she had no personal feelings about the king, that the boy she had nursed back to health in a ruined temple years before was simply a memory, a moment of kindness that had no claim on her future. She had been lying to herself before she even arrived. She had loved him quietly and faithfully for 12 years, the way you tend a fire in winter. Not dramatically, not noisily, but without ever letting it go fully cold. She had negotiated the Frostclaw peace treaty while Callista attended the victory banquet. She had rerouted the northern trade lines during the famine of the 3rd year, keeping 4 packs from starvation through a winter that nearly broke the kingdom. She had sat beside wounded soldiers after the Bloodmoor conflicts and quietly rewritten the patrol routes that kept the same attacks from happening a second time. Every time, Callista had been standing at Evander's shoulder when the public credit was handed out. Every time, Mira had been somewhere behind the scenes, closing the wound the kingdom didn't know it had. She had never demanded recognition. She had told herself that wasn't what she was there for. She was wrong. The carriage stopped at an abandoned border lodge just past the 2nd ridgeline. A place the Royal Scouts used in winter when mountain crossings became impassable. Mira had stayed here before, years ago, during a supply mission. She knew there was firewood stacked inside, and a kettle and a rough wool blanket behind the door. She went inside. She built a fire. She sat down on the floor in front of it with her knees drawn to her chest, and then, alone for the first time in a very long night, she cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just silently, with her forehead pressed against her knees, while the rain came down against the roof and the fire popped and shifted behind the grate. After a while, she reached into the inner pocket of her traveling cloak and took out a small folded piece of cloth. It was crimson, faded with age, roughly cut, the strip she had torn from her cloak all those years ago to bind a dying boy's wrist. She had carried it for 15 years without fully admitting to herself why. She knew why now. She folded it carefully, placed it back inside her cloak, and pressed her palm flat against the floor. Then she stood up. The fire was burning cleanly. The rain was steady outside, and Mira Shadowfen made a quiet decision in the dark. Not a dramatic one, not a vengeful one, just a decision. She was done being invisible. Meanwhile, inside Moonfang Keep, the celebration had ended, and the Morning Council had already discovered what her absence actually meant. 3 trade disputes had arrived overnight. The northern route ledgers were locked in a cipher only Mira used. A delegation from the Iron Peak Pack had arrived, expecting to continue the water rights negotiation Mira had been managing for 6 months. And nobody in the council chamber could find the documents, let alone continue the conversation. Theron Wildfang stood before Evander in the War Council room and said, with the flat calm of a man delivering a verdict, "You crowned the woman who enjoyed power." Evander looked up from the strategy table. Not the woman who carried it. Evander said nothing, but his jaw tightened in a way that Theron had seen before, the expression of a man who already knows the answer and simply has not yet decided whether to admit it. 3 days later, the Iron Peak delegation left without an agreement. It was the first peace negotiation the Northern Throne had failed in 4 years. Chapter 3. The man who saw her clearly, she almost died in the snow. It was not dramatic. It was not a battle wound or a wolf attack. It was simply exhaustion. Days of walking in the wrong shoes through highland terrain, eating whatever she could find along the border roads, sleeping in short, cold hours whenever she could find shelter. When she collapsed near the Western Ridge Trail, she had been awake for 40 hours. She did not know anyone was coming. Alpha Ronan Silvercrest was returning from a border patrol of his western territories when his scouts found her. He arrived on horseback, dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, and crouched beside her in the snow. He checked her pulse first, then her temperature. Then he looked at the royal crest embroidery on the lining of her traveling cloak, the small detail that marked her as someone from Moonfang Keep, and his expression shifted slightly. She came back to consciousness in a warm room, wrapped in wool, with a fire burning nearby. Ronan was sitting across from her at a rough table going over patrol maps. He did not look up immediately. "You were rerouting the Silver Pass supply trail in your sleep," he said. "You kept pointing at the window." Mira stared at the ceiling. "How long?" "Since yesterday afternoon." He set the maps down and looked at her. He had gray eyes, the color of the mountain sky in early morning, and the kind of face that had been tested enough times that very little moved in it, that wasn't genuine. You negotiate routes while unconscious. That's either brilliance or stubbornness. "Both," she said. Something almost like a smile crossed his face. He did not ask who she was or why she had been walking alone through the highlands in winter, with no guard and no mount. He simply brought her broth and waited until she was sitting upright before he spoke again. "I know who you are," he said. "Mira Shadowfen, former royal advisor to the Northern Throne." You designed the winter trade restructure that kept the Stonefang and Ashvale packs from collapsing during the famine of the third year. Mira looked at him. You know about that. I lost 300 wolves in the year before that system, he said quietly. When the starvation stopped, I looked into why. Your name was on the original proposal. Not in the official records, those credited someone else, but the original proposal had your handwriting. Mira was silent. You've been hiding among cowards, he said, not cruelly, just plainly. The way you state something you've already confirmed to be true. You negotiate like a queen, and you've been making yourself small for people who weren't worth the effort. That's an easy thing to see from the outside, she said. It's easy to see from anywhere, he replied. You simply stopped letting yourself look. He gave her his coat when the fire burned low that evening, not possessively, not with any ceremony, simply because she was cold and he had a coat. The gesture was so clean and uncomplicated that it made something ache in her chest in a way she hadn't expected. Not grief, something closer to recognition. She stayed in Ronan's territory for 10 days. She told herself it was for recovery. That wasn't entirely untrue, but it was also because, for the first time in years, she was in a room where someone listened to her speak, without waiting to take credit for what she said. Ronan consulted her on a water rights dispute between two of his eastern packs. She solved it in an afternoon. He looked at her for a long moment afterward. You didn't even hesitate, he said. It's a basic SAS rights conflict with a seasonal variable, she said. The solution has been obvious for months. Whoever was managing it before simply wasn't listening. Nobody was managing it, he said. I've had 3 advisors try and fail in 6 months. Mira said nothing. Stay, Ronan said. It was not a command, not a plea, just an offer set out plainly. Not as a guest, as my chief political strategist. I have 7 outstanding territorial disputes, 2 failing trade agreements, and a water rights system that should have been rebuilt 4 years ago. She looked at him. You don't know me. I know your work, he said, which tells me everything about you that matters. Outside, news arrived by rider. 3 allied packs had formally withdrawn support from the Northern Throne. The Ashvale borders had gone quiet in a way that meant something was building. The Iron Peak Water Agreement was officially abandoned. Evander Grimm's kingdom was beginning to show its first cracks. Chapter 4. The woman nobody could ignore 3 months later. The Moon Summit gathering at Highcrest Hall was the largest regional gathering of alphas and pack leaders in the Northern Territories. 8 kingdoms, 42 delegations, trade agreements, border adjustments, resource negotiations, all conducted over 5 days in the Great Highland Fortress that had hosted these summits for 300 years. Mira arrived with Ronan Silvercrest's delegation. She was not announced. There was no ceremony. She simply walked into the Highcrest main hall in a gray traveling coat with a leather document satchel over one shoulder, and within 20 minutes, the hall had quietly rearranged itself around her presence. It was not magic. It was not beauty, though she carried herself with an ease that commanded attention. It was something more practical and more impressive than either of those things. Word moved fast among the delegations. The woman who had renegotiated the Frostclaw peace, rebuilt the winter trade lines, and quietly prevented 4 border wars in 12 years was here, and she was advising Silvercrest. Alpha leaders who had spent months stuck in dead-end disputes found reasons to walk past the Silvercrest table. Old contacts she had worked with in Evander's court came to greet her with a warmth they had never shown her inside Moonfang Keep. She was doing the same work she had always done, but she was doing it where people could see it. Ronan watched the hall respond to her with the satisfaction of a man who already knew what he had invited in. On the second day of the summit, a major cross-territory trade dispute came to the floor, one that had been deadlocked for 11 months between 4 delegations. Ronan quietly gave Mira the floor. She stood. She laid out a 3-point resolution in 8 minutes. Clear, precise, and structured around a seasonal adjustment none of the previous negotiators had thought to account for. The hall was quiet for a moment. Then the Alpha of the Stonefang delegation started laughing. Not mockingly, but with the relieved, slightly embarrassed laugh of a man who has been staring at a door for a year and just watched someone walk up and open it with one hand. "Where has she been?" he said to nobody in particular. Ronan simply folded his hands on the table. That evening, at the summit's formal gathering, Ronan stood before the assembled Alphas and announced officially, Mira Shadowfen would serve as chief political strategist and territorial counsel to the Silvercrest kingdom. The hall applauded, and across that hall, standing with the Northern Throne delegation, his expression closed and still, Evander Grimm watched. He had not spoken to Mira since the coronation ceremony. He had not reached out. He had told himself in those first weeks that the kingdom would stabilize, that the trade disputes were manageable, that the alliances were solid enough to hold without intervention. He had been wrong on every count, and now here she was, commanding a room full of alphas with the same quiet authority she had always carried, except now everybody could see it. Nyra Wolfbane, one of the senior female advisors in the Silvercrest delegation, leaned toward Mira that night as the formal dinner began. "You spent years making yourself smaller so others could feel powerful," Nyra said quietly. "Look at this room now. Every person in here is orienting toward you like you're the sun." Mira looked out across the hall. "I was never difficult to value," she said. A pause. They were simply looking in the wrong direction. On the other side of the room, Ronan was standing beside her empty chair, waiting. When she returned to the table, he pulled the chair out for her before taking his own seat. It was a simple thing. A quiet, ordinary gesture of consideration. Evander saw it from 40 feet away. It hit him like a blow, not because of what it meant to him, because of what it meant for her. Because Ronan had done it without thinking, naturally, automatically. The way you treat someone whose presence you actually value. He had never once done that for Mira in 12 years. That night, back in his private chambers, Evander found it. He had not been looking for it. He had been going through an old campaign trunk his aide had pulled from storage. Maps and documents from the early years of his reign. And it had been folded inside a cloth pouch at the bottom of the trunk, tucked beneath old war correspondence. A small piece of faded crimson cloth, rough at the edges, cut, not torn cleanly, old enough to be stiff in his hands. He turned it over. He had no memory at first of where it came from. And then, slowly, the way something enormous moves when it finally starts to move, it came back. A ruined temple, winter, blood and firelight and cold stone, a girl with quiet eyes and steady hands, and a voice that had cut through his fever like cool water. "You survived this night, and the world will bow to you one day." He sat down on the floor of his chambers with the cloth in his hands. He had been searching in some quiet, buried part of himself for that girl for 15 years. She had been beside him the entire time. Chapter 5. The weight of what he lost morning came gray and cold over Ronan's highland territory. Mira stood at the window of her chamber with a cup of tea and watched the clouds move over the ridgeline. There was a kind of peace to this place that Moonfang Keep had never given her, not because it was softer, but because it was honest. Nothing here pretended to be more than it was. The mountain was a mountain, the cold was cold. The people around her said what they meant. She had almost forgotten that was possible. In the adjoining room, she could hear the early morning sounds of Ronan's staff beginning the day. Boots on stone, the creak of a door, the distant smell of wood smoke. Ordinary sounds, safe ones. Ronan appeared in the doorway with a territorial report in one hand and his own cup of tea in the other. He was already dressed and alert in the way that men are, when they have spent years training themselves to be ready for anything before the sun is fully up. Evander's eastern trade route has collapsed completely, he said, setting the report on the table. His tone was matter-of-fact, not gloating. The Ashvale Pack has formally requested third-party arbitration. The Bloodmoor border has 3 unresolved incidents in the last 2 weeks. Mira looked at the report without touching it. The food stores? Projections show a 14% shortfall in the Stonefang region by midwinter if the supply lines aren't rerouted before the first heavy snow. She was quiet for a moment. She knew those routes. She had built them. She had run the projections herself 3 years ago, and she had prepared a contingency plan that accounted for exactly this kind of cascade failure. She had put it in the Royal Archive under a catalog reference nobody else had ever used. It would be sitting there right now, perfectly ready, and absolutely useless because nobody left in that court knew to look for it. "You could fix it," Ronan said, not as a suggestion, just as a statement of observable fact. "I know. That's not the same thing as whether you should." She looked at him. "Your value was never the problem," he said. "Their willingness to recognize it was." He's paused. "Don't solve their problems from a distance just because you can. You've spent enough of your life carrying things for people who didn't notice the weight." She nodded slowly. Back in Moonfang Keep, things were fragmenting in ways that 2 months ago would have seemed impossible. The Noble Council was meeting daily and accomplishing almost nothing. Every dispute that came before them required either a trade precedent Mira had set, a legal clause she had drafted, or a territorial relationship she had cultivated. And without her to navigate any of it, the council spent its hours in argument rather than resolution. Callista sat at Evander's right hand during these meetings with an expression of composed authority that she had practiced into a kind of art form. She understood court politics. She understood appearances, alliances, the management of noble egos and public image. She understood everything about being seen as a queen, and she had no idea how to run one. That knowledge arrived in her own private chambers on a quiet evening, not as a dramatic revelation, but as the slow accumulation of evidence that even she could no longer argue with. She sat alone with a territorial ledger she couldn't read, and a negotiation brief she couldn't untangle, and the growing, uncomfortable certainty that she had spent 12 years positioning herself for a crown that she had never actually learned how to wear. Evander found her there. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, and for the first time, neither of them pretended. "You never loved me," Callista said. Her voice was quiet. There was no accusation in it, not the way she did. "Callista." "I'm not angry," she said. "I want you to know that. I understood what we were. I was simply willing to be enough." She looked at the ledger in her hands. "I thought being visible was the same as being necessary." A pause. She never needed to be visible. She simply was necessary. Evander said nothing, because she was right. He had loved Callista with the part of him that understood politics and appearances and the machinery of a public life. She was graceful, intelligent, strategic, and she fit perfectly beside him in every ceremony and council and public function where a king needed a queen. But there was another part of him, the part that lived in the memory of a ruined temple and a dying fire, and a girl who had stayed awake 3 nights to keep him breathing. And that part had always belonged to Mira. He had simply refused to look at it directly. He had chosen what was convenient over what was true. And now what was true had left him. He found Theron Wildfang that same night in the old records room. "Tell me how to reach her," he said. Theron looked up from the document he had been reading. He studied the king for a long moment. The exhaustion in his face, the absence of the usual cold authority, something cracked and honest in his eyes that Theron had not seen there before. "You're going to the Moon Summit," Theron said. "She'll be there." "I know. And when you find her—" Evander was quiet. "Tell her the truth," Theron said. "Not the version that makes you look better. the actual truth. He went back to his document. She'll know the difference. She always has. Chapter 6. The reckoning at Highcrest, the Moon Summit's 4th day, was its largest. Over 500 wolves gathered in the Highcrest Great Hall for the formal session. Alphas, pack elders, diplomats, warriors, all pressed into the long stone hall with its high arched windows and the great fire burning at its center. Mira arrived with the Silvercrest delegation as she had every day. She moved through the room with the same quiet, present efficiency, greeting the Stonefang elder by name, exchanging a word with the Bloodmoor representative about their water rights revision, pausing briefly to confirm a time with a young diplomat from the Ashvale borders. Around her, powerful people adjusted their movements to accommodate her without quite realizing they were doing it. Ronan noticed. He always noticed. The session came to order. Trade agreements were presented. Border adjustments were debated. An old grievance between two Highland packs was brought to the floor and resolved, cleanly, in 20 minutes. When Mira offered a territorial precedent that silenced both sides simultaneously, and then the doors of the hall opened, and Evander Grimm walked in. He had no crown today, no ceremonial armor, just his traveling coat, dark and plain, with the Northern Throne crest at his collar. His 2 senior guards remained at the door. He entered alone. The hall went very quiet. Every Alpha present understood what it meant for a ruling king to arrive at a neutral summit without ceremony. It was not a power move, it was the opposite. Evander walked to the center of the hall. He did not look around the room for effect. He looked directly at Mira, and he spoke. "I stand before this gathering not as Alpha King," he said, "but as a man who made serious errors in judgment and owes a public accounting for them." Silence. For 12 years, this woman managed the systems that kept my kingdom alive. She negotiated peace during conflicts that should have become wars. She built trade routes during famines that should have killed thousands. She held the Northern Throne together through crises that most of this room never knew were happening, because she resolved them before they became visible. His voice was steady, but it cost him something. I gave public credit elsewhere. I accepted those credits as if they were earned by others. I made choices based on appearance and political convenience, rather than truth. He paused, and then, when she had every reason to be angry and every right to be broken, Mira Shadowfen left my court with more dignity than I have ever managed in my own. The hall was absolutely still. Mira stood at the Silvercrest table. She had not moved. Her face was calm, not cold, not closed, but very, very still, the way the surface of deep water is still while everything beneath it moves. "I am asking you to return," Evander said, directly to her, not to the hall. "I am not asking you to forgive what I failed to do or to forget what happened. I am simply telling you, truthfully, in front of every witness in this room, that the kingdom you built is failing without you. And that is entirely my failure, not yours." Mira was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, simply, "You only noticed my absence after your kingdom grew cold." The words fell into the room like stones into still water. Several alphas shifted uncomfortably. A few elders nodded very slightly. The involuntary acknowledgement of people hearing a truth they already knew. Evander said nothing, because there was nothing to say. That was when the attack came. It happened without warning, the way the worst things always do. The windows on the north wall shattered inward simultaneously. Wolves poured through the gaps, rogue wolves, unmarked, moving fast and with coordinated intent. They were armed with silver-edged weapons, which meant this was not opportunism. This had been planned. The hall became chaos in seconds. Alphas shifted forms. Warriors drew weapons. Ronan was on his feet and moving toward Mira before the last of the glass had finished falling. But Evander moved faster. He put himself in front of Mira, between her body and a silver blade coming directly at her from 6 feet away. The blade went across his left side, a deep cut that dropped him to one knee immediately. He stayed there, one hand pressed against the wound, the other still raised, toward whoever came next. The rogue wolves were overwhelmed within 4 minutes. They had underestimated how many warriors were in this room. When the fighting stopped, Evander was still on one knee on the stone floor, bleeding heavily, his breathing controlled and deliberate. Mira was beside him. She had moved without thinking. The same way she had moved 15 years ago, the same hands, the same instinct. She pressed her palm against his side. He turned and looked at her face. "You were never beneath the crown, Mira," he said. His voice was rough. She kept her hand pressed against his side. Her expression was unreadable. "The crown was beneath you." Chapter 7. What Love Vows. The recovery chambers of Highcrest Hall were quiet at night. Evander lay with his wound dressed, his breathing easier now, the worst of the blood loss behind him. The hall's healers had done their work well. He would recover fully. He knew it. He was not afraid of the wound. He was afraid of the woman sitting in the chair beside his bed. Mira had stayed. She had not been asked. She had not announced her intention. She had simply been there when the healers finished, sitting in the plain wooden chair with her hands folded in her lap, and she had remained there. As the hall quieted and the lights dimmed, and the rest of the summit retired for the night, he watched the ceiling for a while. "I found the cloth," he said finally. She looked at him. "The crimson cloth. In my campaign trunk." A pause. "I've had it for 15 years. Mira said nothing, but something shifted in her eyes. "I remembered," he said. "The temple, the fire, your voice, how long you stayed." He let out a slow breath. "I have been looking for that girl, quietly in every room I walked into for 15 years. I never understood why I kept looking. And now you understand." "Now I understand." His voice was quiet. "I built a throne on the wrong foundation and called it strength. I chose what was visible over what was true. And the woman who deserved the most from me, I gave her the least." Mira stood and walked to the window. Outside, the highland sky was beginning to pale at its far edge, the first gray light of early morning pushing up behind the mountains. "You came to the summit tonight," she said, "and you spoke the truth in front of 500 witnesses. That cost you something real." She turned and looked at him. "I know what that took." "It took 12 years too long," he said. "Yes." She was not softening the truth for him. "It did." He sat up slowly, despite the wound. "I'm not asking you to choose me over Ronan. I'm not asking you to return to a court that failed you. I'm not standing here with a crown." He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking you to let me try, slowly, to be the man who actually deserves to know you." Mira studied him. And somewhere down the corridor, Ronan Silvercrest stood alone with a cup of cold tea and looked at the gray morning light on the stone wall and understood, with the clear, undefended understanding of a man who genuinely respects the woman he cares for, that this was not his decision to make. He had told her, "Choose the place your heart survives, not choose me." Because that was the difference between loving someone and needing to own them. He set down his tea, straightened his coat, and went to find his advisors to begin the morning preparations. Back in the recovery chamber, Mira walked to Evander's bedside. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached out and placed her hand, gently, flat against his chest, against the scar that sat just over his heart. The scar that had been there since the night in the ruined temple when a rogue wolf had nearly killed a boy who didn't yet know he would be a king. She had treated that wound too. "You asked me once without knowing you were asking, to believe in you," she said. Her voice was low and even. "I did, for 15 years. Without asking for anything back." He kept his eyes on her face and said nothing. "I will not go back to being invisible," she said. "Not for anyone. Not even for you. I know. If you want to know me now, truly know me, it begins with that understanding." "I know," he said again. She did not move her hand away. Then we begin slowly, she said, from the beginning, without thrones and politics and the weight of what we both lost. Evander closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, something had shifted in his face, not the authority of a king, but the bare, unguarded expression of a man who has been carrying a lie for a very long time and has finally, at great cost, let it down. "I loved you too late," he said. Mira was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You loved me exactly when you were capable of it. The question is who you choose to be now." She took his hand, not his surrender, not his forgiveness granted all at once, like a door swung wide open, but as the first careful step across a threshold, the beginning of something that would have to be built honestly, slowly, the way anything real has to be built. Outside, the sun finally broke above the eastern ridge. The morning light came across the stone floors of High Crest Hall in long gold lines, and the mountains outside the window were clean and white and very still. In the great hall below, the fifth and final day of the Moon Summit was beginning. Ronan Silvercrest's delegation would represent itself ably. The territorial disputes would continue to be resolved. The alliances Mira had helped shape over the past 3 months would hold, and then hold further. The world was still moving, still demanding, still full of crises that needed steady hands and clear minds and the willingness to do the work nobody else could see. Mira was very good at that work. She had simply, finally, stopped doing it for people who refused to see her. And as the light grew and the morning sharpened and the hall below came to life with the sounds of a world beginning another day, Evander Grimm held her hand, and, for the first time in 15 years, he understood the difference between holding a throne and holding something that actually mattered. Some people do not recognize the hands that carried them until those hands finally let go. And by then, the only thing left to do is earn them back. Slowly, honestly, one day at a time. The question is never whether someone deserves a second chance. The question is whether they are finally ready to be worthy of the first one. If this story stayed with you, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, do you think Mira should have given Evander that second chance, or had he simply waited too long? There is no wrong answer. I want to know what you actually believe, and if you watched all the way to the end, thank you. Genuinely. Stories like this one only reach the people who need them because of viewers like you who stay, engage, and come back. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is a great time. New stories go up regularly, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. Until next time, remember this: you were never difficult to value. Some people were simply looking in the wrong direction. Take care of yourself, and we will see you in the next story.